April 8th, 1994. A woman climbs down from a flagpole at the edge of a runway in Hertfordshire. Her name is Anne de Havilland. The flag she carries belonged to her grandfather. Standing beside her is Dick Bishop, son of the man who designed the world's first jet airliner. Together, they walk to a waiting tiger moth. The old biplane lifts from the grass, circles once, and disappears into an English spring sky. Behind them, silence. 64 years of flight, gone. At its peak, this one site in a small market town north of London built the aircraft that defeated Nazi Germany, launched the age of commercial jet travel, and taught every airline manufacturer on Earth how to keep passengers alive at 40,000 feet. The lessons learned here made Boeing what it is today. So how does a place that gave the world the jet age end up as a business park and a housing estate? The answer is not the market. It is not technology. It is a story of institutional decisions, political choices, and a name that was erased long before the runway was. In January 1920, Geoffrey de Havilland was 38 years old, out of work, and owed nothing to anyone. The company he had been designing aircraft for, Airco, had just been purchased and stripped for parts by a conglomerate with no interest in aviation. The factories were sold, the workforce disbanded, the aircraft cancelled. Most men in his position would have waited, applied for a government contract, sought a patron. Geoffrey de Havilland did none of those things. With modest premises at Stag Lane Aerodrome in Edgware, and a small group of engineers who believed what he believed, he incorporated the de Havilland Aircraft Company Limited on September 26, 1920. The capital was his own, the risk was his own, the vision was entirely his own. Through the 1920s, de Havilland built light aircraft that ordinary people could actually fly. The DH-60 Moth, first flown in 1925, became the backbone of private aviation across the British Empire. Flying clubs opened, instructors trained. A generation of pilots learned their trade on de Havilland machines. When the RAF needed elementary trainers as war approached, it reached for the DH-82 Tiger Moth, designed at Stag Lane, built at Hatfield, flown by tens of thousands of young men who would go on to fight the Battle of Britain. By 1930, Stag Lane was surrounded. London's suburbs had crept outward until the aerodrome was hemmed in on every side. De Havilland purchased farmland near the market town of Hatfield in Hertfordshire and began the move north. What he built there was not merely a factory. In 1934, an imposing Art Deco administration building rose at the edge of the airfield. Clean lines, steel and glass. A building that looked like the future. A flying school. A canteen. A runway long enough for whatever came next. Geoffrey de Havilland built all of it without a government grant, without a nationalization order, without a committee deciding what British aviation should look like. He simply decided, and he built it. That independence was not incidental. It was the source of everything that followed. The Mosquito was designed because de Havilland believed in it when the Air Ministry did not. The Comet was built because de Havilland saw the jet age coming before any government committee had written a specification for it. Every breakthrough that would make Hatfield famous emerged from the same quality. The freedom to back a conviction with money and accept the consequences. It is worth holding that thought, because the institution that would eventually destroy Hatfield was built on the opposite principle entirely. The belief that British aviation was too important to be left to the people who understood it best. Geoffrey de Havilland himself lived until 1965. He was knighted. He was celebrated. He saw his company absorbed into Hawker Siddeley. He saw his name removed from the factory gates. Whether he made peace with that, history does not record. What history does record is what his factory produced in the years when it was still his. And nothing that came after it. not the mergers, not the nationalizations, not the restructurings, ever quite matched what a man with his own money and his own conviction built on a Hertfordshire field. In the summer of 1940, the British Air Ministry received a proposal from de Havilland for an unarmed twin-engine bomber built almost entirely from wood. No gun turrets, no defensive armament of any kind. Its only protection against enemy fighters would be speed. The Air Ministry rejected it. Their reasoning was not unreasonable by the standards of the time. Wood was considered obsolete. An unarmed bomber was considered suicidal. And de Havilland, for all its reputation in light aircraft, had never built a front-line combat machine. The proposal was filed and forgotten. De Havilland built it anyway. The design team moved from Hatfield to a requisitioned country house called Salisbury Hall, a few miles away, to avoid being targeted by German bombers. Working in secrecy, they constructed the prototype in less than 11 months. On November 25, 1940, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the founder's son, flew it from Hatfield for the first time. The aircraft was fast. Faster than almost anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air against it. The Air Ministry, presented with a fait accompli, placed an order. They had been wrong. De Havilland had been right. The DH-98 Mosquito went on to become the most versatile combat aircraft of the Second World War. Bomber, night fighter, photo reconnaissance, pathfinder, anti-shipping strike. It served in every theatre, in every role that required speed and precision. Its loss rate in bomber command was the lowest of any aircraft type. At its peak, the de Havilland workforce exceeded 18,000 people. Production dominated Hatfield so completely that all other work was contracted out. Morris Motors built Tiger Moths at its car factory in Oxford. Other manufacturers absorbed the overflow. A second Mosquito line opened at Leavesden. Nearly 7,800 Mosquitoes were built across Britain, Canada, and Australia before production finally ended. On the 3rd of October 1940, just weeks before the prototype's first flight, a German Junkers Ju-88 found Hatfield through the camouflage. 4 bombs struck the factory. 21 people were killed. More than 70 were injured. Work on the Mosquito was disrupted for days. It resumed. It always resumed. That resilience, the willingness to absorb punishment and continue, ran through everything de Havilland built. It would be tested again, in a different way, by a different kind of catastrophe in the years ahead. But in 1945, as the war ended and the Mosquito's production run wound down, Hatfield stood at the absolute summit of British manufacturing. It had proven something that no government committee had believed possible. The question now was what came next. Geoffrey de Havilland already had the answer. He had been thinking about it since 1943. Not a faster fighter, not a bigger bomber, something the world had never seen before. In March 1943, the British government established the Brabazon Committee to plan the country's post-war aviation requirements. One recommendation called for a pressurized, jet-powered mailplane capable of cruising at 400 miles per hour. Most manufacturers looked at the specification and saw a distant future. Geoffrey de Havilland looked at it and saw next Tuesday. De Havilland had been awarded the contract by 1945. The man tasked with the design was Ronald Eric Bishop, the same engineer who had drawn the Mosquito. Bishop's new machine, designated the DH-106 and named the Comet, would carry 36 passengers in a pressurized cabin at 40,000 feet, at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. Twice as fast as anything currently flying commercially, twice as high. Quieter than any piston-engine aircraft its passengers had ever boarded. The specifications were so advanced that de Havilland had to design the engines as well as the airframe. Everything was new. Everything was Hatfield. On July 27, 1949, a warm summer evening in Hertfordshire, the prototype rolled to the end of the runway. At the controls was John Cunningham, de Havilland's chief test pilot and one of the most celebrated night fighter aces of the war. It happened to be his 30th birthday. The press had gathered earlier in the day for a photo opportunity, watched some taxi runs, and largely gone home by the time Cunningham decided conditions were right. He took the Comet to 10,000 feet, came back down to fly 100 feet above the runway in salute to the engineers watching from the grass, and landed after 31 minutes. The jet age had begun. Hatfield had started it. Commercial service opened on May 2, 1952, with a BOAC Comet departing London for Johannesburg. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret flew on a special flight in June 1953. Orders arrived from airlines across the world. The British press declared that Britain now led the world in aviation, and for once, the British press was not exaggerating. At Hatfield, the men and women who had built the Comet understood what they had made. They had not improved on an existing idea. They had created the category. Every commercial jet aircraft that would ever fly, every Boeing, every Airbus, every aircraft that would carry billions of passengers through the second half of the 20th century and beyond, descended from the machine that first lifted from this runway on a July evening in 1949. The world did not know it yet, but within 2 years, the Comet's story would take a turn that nobody at Hatfield could have anticipated, and the consequences would echo for decades. Britain had won the race to the jet age. The prize, as it turned out, would go to someone else. The first warning came without warning at all. 35,000 feet above the Mediterranean, on a clear January morning in 1954, when a BOAC Comet simply ceased to exist. January 10th, 1954. BOAC Flight 781 departed Rome's Ciampino Airport at 10:30 in the morning, bound for London. It was the 8th and final leg of a journey from Singapore. The weather was clear. The aircraft was the same Comet, registered GALYP, that had operated the very first commercial jet service nearly 2 years earlier. 20 minutes after takeoff, climbing through 27,000 feet, transmission from the crew ceased mid-sentence. Witnesses on the island of Elba looked up and saw the aircraft falling from the sky in pieces, trailing fire. All 35 people on board were killed. The Comet fleet was grounded. An investigation began. Modifications were made to fuel systems, to control surfaces, to every possible cause that engineering imagination could suggest. 6 weeks later, satisfied that the danger had been addressed, the authorities returned the Comet to service. On April 8, 1954, 87 days after Flight 781, a second Comet disintegrated above the Mediterranean near Naples. 21 people died. This time, the fleet did not return to service. The certificate of airworthiness was revoked. The production line at Hatfield was halted, and the question settled over the entire aviation world like a fog. What was killing the Comet? What followed was the most extensive aircraft investigation in history to that point. The Royal Navy was dispatched to the floor of the Mediterranean to recover wreckage from depths of up to 500 feet. Salvage teams trawled the seabed for months. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, investigators painstakingly reconstructed GALYP from recovered fragments, piece by piece, on a purpose-built frame. Meanwhile, BOAC donated an identical airframe, GALYU, for structural testing. Engineers at Farnborough submerged the entire fuselage in a purpose-built water tank and subjected it to thousands of simulated pressurization cycles. On the 24th of June 1954, after 3,057 simulated flights, GALYU burst open. The cause was metal fatigue. The repeated expansion and contraction of the pressurized fuselage, inflating and deflating with every flight like a balloon, had propagated microscopic cracks from the corners of the passenger windows outward through the skin of the aircraft, until the structure could no longer hold. The science of pressurized fuselage fatigue was not fully understood in 1952. The testing regimes that existed were not adequate to detect it. De Havilland had built the most advanced airliner in the world and had taken it to the edge of what the science of the time could know. The edge, it turned out, was not far enough. The Cohen inquiry concluded in November 1954 that the basic design of the Comet was sound. That finding was accurate and important, and almost entirely useless. The Comet had been grounded for 7 months. Airline orders were hemorrhaging. Which had seriously considered ordering the Comet was watching a different aircraft take shape in Seattle. And here is the detail that history has never quite given Hatfield its due for. John Cunningham, the man who had flown the Comet's first flight on his 30th birthday, who had watched it enter service with quiet pride, later recalled conversations with engineers from Boeing and Douglas in the aftermath of the disasters. Their message, delivered privately and without fanfare, was unambiguous. If their aircraft had entered service first, they told him, they would have encountered the same problem. The physics of pressurized fuselage fatigue did not discriminate by nationality. The cracks would have appeared in American aluminium just as readily as in British. De Havilland had simply been first, and being first meant paying a price that should, by rights, have been shared across the entire industry. Instead, what happened was this. The investigation at Farnborough, the water tank tests, the wreckage reconstruction, the meticulous documentation of how metal fails under repeated stress, established the foundational principles of aircraft fatigue analysis that every manufacturer in the world then adopted. Boeing incorporated those principles directly into the design of the 707. So did Douglas in the DC-8. So did every airliner manufacturer that followed. The oval windows on every aircraft you have ever boarded exist because of what Hatfield discovered, at the cost of 56 lives and the commercial destruction of the Comet program. The world received the lesson. Hatfield paid the tuition. De Havilland spent the grounding years redesigning. The Comet too featured thicker fuselage skin and oval windows. The Comet 4, larger, stronger, with genuinely transatlantic range, entered service on October 4th, 1958, operated by BOAC on the first ever jet service across the North Atlantic. It beat the Boeing 707 by 3 weeks. The headlines called it a triumph. It was not a triumph. It was a footnote. The Comet 4 still needed to refuel in Canada on the westbound crossing. The 707 flew New York to Paris non-stop. The Comet carried around 80 passengers. The 707 carried up to 180. Pan American ordered 20 707s. Then BOAC, the airline that had launched the Comet in 1952, that had given de Havilland its first commercial customer, that had draped itself in the reflected glory of British aviation pioneering, ordered the 707 as well. In the end, 114 Comets were built. Boeing delivered more than 1,000 707s. The men and women at Hatfield, who had given everything to build the Comet, did not lose because they built something inferior. They lost because they built something too early, paid the price of that earliness in blood and reputation, and then watched the beneficiaries of their sacrifice collect the reward. There is a particular kind of institutional injustice in that outcome, one that goes beyond bad luck or market forces. It demands a question that the chapters ahead will answer. Why, when de Havilland had absorbed the catastrophe, redesigned the aircraft, and proved the concepts that the entire industry was now exploiting, did Britain not build on what Hatfield had started? The answer begins with a man named Hawker, and it ends with an Act of Parliament. In 1955, while de Havilland engineers were still rebuilding the Comet, and Boeing's engineers were finalizing the 707, Pan American World Airways made a decision that settled the question of who would own the jet age. On October 13, 1955, Pan Am's president, Juan Trippe, signed orders for 20 Boeing 707s and 25 Douglas DC-8s. The announcement was made at a press conference in New York. It was not a tentative expression of interest. It was a declaration. The most powerful airline in the world had chosen its aircraft, and neither of them was British. The reasons were not sentimental. The 707 was wider. It carried more passengers in a single cabin cross-section than the Comet could manage in its entire fuselage. Boeing had taken the hard lesson of Farnborough and built a structure that it publicly demonstrated by striking a fuselage with 5 industrial blades. The hull leaked air, but it did not crack. More importantly, Boeing had spent the years of the Comet's grounding doing what American industry did better than anyone: scaling up, cutting unit costs, and offering airlines exactly the configurations they wanted. The 707 first flew on December 20th, 1957. Pan Am began commercial service on October 26th, 1958. Within months, orders were arriving from TWA, Qantas, Lufthansa, Air France, Sabena. BOAC, the airline that had inaugurated the Comet in 1952 and worn that achievement like a badge, ordered the 707 as a replacement. The airline that had given de Havilland its greatest moment had now paid Boeing for the privilege of moving on. At Hatfield, the engineers watched this with the particular helplessness of people who know they invented something that someone else is now selling. The Comet 4 entered service on October 4th, 1958, and crossed the Atlantic. The photographs were published. The headlines were written. 3 weeks later, the 707 crossed the same ocean non-stop, with twice as many passengers, without stopping to refuel. The race had been run. The result was not close. By 1960, the commercial logic was irreversible. The 707 was dominating every long-haul route that mattered. The Comet soldiered on with smaller airlines. Dan Air would fly it until 1981. But the grand vision of British commercial aviation leadership that Hatfield had briefly made real was over. In its place was something quieter and more damaging: the growing conviction in Whitehall and in the boardrooms of British industry that the country could not sustain independent aircraft manufacturers at the scale the Americans operated. That conviction would have consequences far beyond the Comet. But first, in 1960, came the first act of institutional erasure, and it arrived not from a government ministry or a parliamentary committee. It arrived in the form of a cheque. Hawker Siddeley Group, a large British aerospace and engineering conglomerate, purchased the de Havilland Aircraft Company. The transaction was commercial. The consequences were permanent. De Havilland was no longer a company. It was a division. And divisions, as history repeatedly demonstrates, do not get to keep their names for long. The de Havilland name disappeared from official use in 1963. 3 years after the acquisition, Hawker Siddeley completed the administrative absorption, and the identity that Geoffrey de Havilland had built from nothing in 1920 was retired. The aircraft continued to be designed and built at Hatfield. The engineers remained. The runways remained. The institutional memory remained, held in the hands of men and women who had worked there for decades and knew no other place. But the name was gone, and with it, something harder to quantify. The direct line of accountability between a founder's conviction and the decisions made on the factory floor. Geoffrey de Havilland, still alive, watched his company become a subdivision of a conglomerate. He died in 1965, 2 years after his name was removed from the gates of the factory he had built with his own money on a Hertfordshire field. Hatfield continued to produce. Under Hawker Siddeley, work proceeded on the Trident airliner and the DH-125 business jet, a design that would prove remarkably durable, surviving through multiple ownership changes and still flying decades later as the Hawker series. Design studies began for a short-haul feeder jet that would eventually become the HS-146. Studies also began for a pan-European wide-body aircraft, the HBN-100, work that fed directly into what became the Airbus A300. The engineers at Hatfield were, in other words, still doing what they had always done, building the future before anyone else had written the specification for it. What they were no longer doing was controlling what happened to that work. The HS-146 program, the feeder jet that would become Hatfield's final aircraft, was approved by Hawker Siddeley's board in April 1971. 3 years later, in October 1974, with inflation running at double digits and the oil crisis battering aviation economics, Hawker Siddeley suspended the program. Not cancelled, suspended. The engineering work was mothballed. The team dispersed to other projects. The aircraft that might have kept Hatfield viable through the 1980s was placed in a drawer and left there. It took a nationalization to bring it back. In 1977, the Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act passed through Parliament under the Callaghan government. British Aircraft Corporation, Hawker Siddeley Aviation, Hawker Siddeley Dynamics, and Scottish Aviation were merged by statute into a single state-owned entity, British Aerospace. The logic was familiar. Britain's fragmented aerospace industry needed consolidation to compete with the Americans and the emerging European consortium. The execution was blunt. Decades of distinct institutional cultures, engineering traditions, and commercial relationships were reorganized by parliamentary decree into a single org chart. For Hatfield, there was one immediate consequence that looked, at the time, like good news. The program was relaunched in July 1978, redesignated the BAE 146, and Hatfield was confirmed as the design and assembly center. Jobs were secured. The runway stayed open. The future looked, briefly, promising. It was the last piece of genuinely good news Hatfield would receive, because British Aerospace, as it turned out, was not a company in any meaningful sense. It was a political construction, and political constructions, when the politics change, do not survive. On the 29th of April 1977, British Aerospace came into existence as a statutory corporation. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary act of industrial engineering. 4 separate companies, each with its own history, its own workforce culture, its own engineering traditions accumulated over decades, were merged by Act of Parliament into a single entity overnight. No market transaction, no negotiation between willing parties. A vote in the House of Commons, and it was done. The stated purpose was competitiveness. Britain's aerospace industry, the argument ran, was too fragmented to survive against Boeing, against McDonnell Douglas, against the emerging Airbus consortium that France and West Germany were building with deliberate state backing. Consolidation was not optional. It was existential. There was truth in that argument. There was also a great deal that the argument obscured. What nationalization did to Hatfield was not immediately visible. The factory kept running. The BAE 146 program was relaunched. Jobs were protected. On the surface, the intervention looked benign, even beneficial. But underneath the surface, the logic of the organization had changed in ways that would take years to fully reveal themselves. Before 1977, Hatfield's decisions about what to design, what to build, where to invest, were made by people whose careers and reputations were bound to the outcomes. Under Hawker Siddeley, that accountability had already been diluted. Under British Aerospace, it was diluted further still. Hatfield was now one site among many, one line item in a national aerospace budget, managed by people in Farnborough and Whitehall, who had responsibilities stretching from civil airliners to guided missiles to naval systems. The BAE 146 was not the only program. It was not even the most important one. The prestige and the money lay in defense contracts, in Tornadoes and Nimrods, and the vast Al-Yamama arms deal with Saudi Arabia signed in 1985, worth billions over decades. Civil aviation at Hatfield was, in the hierarchy of British Aerospace's priorities, a secondary concern. Then, on the 1st of January 1981, British Aerospace was privatised. Under the Thatcher government's programme of returning state industries to the market, BAE was converted to a public limited company and its shares sold. The workforce did not change. The factories did not change. The org chart did not fundamentally change. What changed was the metric by which every decision would henceforth be judged. Not engineering excellence, not national capability, not the preservation of skills that had taken generations to accumulate. Quarterly returns, share price, return on capital employed. A company that had been created by government decree to serve a national industrial purpose was now answerable to shareholders who had no particular interest in where the BAE 146 was assembled, or whether Hatfield's engineering tradition survived into the next decade. They were interested in whether the numbers were good. Through the mid-1980s, the numbers were adequate. The 146 sold steadily. It was, genuinely, the quietest jet airliner in the world, and airlines operating from noise-sensitive airports valued that. Peak production reached around 36 aircraft per year. But the economics of the program were always fragile. The aircraft required 4 engines where its competitors used 2. Unit costs were high. The break-even figure kept rising, and in 1988, BAE made a decision that had nothing to do with aircraft at all. It purchased the Rover Group, Britain's last volume car manufacturer, for £150 million. The company that owned Hatfield had just bought a struggling car business with £2 billion of banking capacity tied up in it. The clock, though nobody said so publicly, had started. In August 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. Within weeks, the global aviation industry entered a collapse that no balance sheet had anticipated. Airlines cancelled orders, deferred deliveries, and parked aircraft in the desert. Passenger numbers fell. Fuel costs spiked. The carefully constructed economics of every commercial aircraft program in the world were recalculated overnight, and almost none of them still worked. For British Aerospace, the timing was catastrophic. The company was already carrying the dead weight of the Rover Group acquisition. a car business hemorrhaging cash in a recession, consuming the banking capacity that BAE's aerospace divisions needed to invest and compete. The BAE 146, never a high-margin product, was now being ordered by airlines that could not afford it, deferred by airlines that had ordered it, and scrutinized by a board that was running out of patience with a program that had cost hundreds of millions and had never, in 9 years of production, returned a profit. The regional aircraft division was, in the language of the financial press, a problem to be managed. In the language of the people who worked there, it was their life's work. Through 1991 and into 1992, the internal pressure built. BAE's chief executive John Cahill, appointed in 1991 specifically to impose financial discipline on a company that had expanded recklessly through the boom years, reviewed every division against a single criterion. Could it generate acceptable returns? The 146 program failed that test. The question was not whether to act, but how drastically. The first public signal came on 12 February 1992. British Aerospace announced that all final assembly of the BAE 146 would transfer from Hatfield to Woodford in Greater Manchester. The justification was operational efficiency. Consolidating production at a single site reduced duplication and overhead. The announcement was made in the language of rationalization, the vocabulary that large organizations use when they wish to describe the destruction of something without appearing to take responsibility for it. At Hatfield, the people who heard the announcement understood what it meant. Final assembly was not merely one function among many. It was the keystone. Remove it and everything else, design, testing, component manufacture, flight development, lost its reason to be at this site. The transfer of assembly to Woodford was not a restructuring. It was a sentence, with the execution date to be confirmed later. They did not have to wait long. On September 23, 1992, British Aerospace announced that all aircraft design and production at Hatfield would cease by the end of 1993. The airfield would close in spring 1994. The site would be handed to property developers. In the same announcement, BAE wrote off £1 billion of assets, the largest single asset write-off in British corporate history to that point. Across the company, 60,000 jobs were cut, came from the regional aircraft division. At Hatfield, 2,500 people received the news. 2,500 people whose skills, in composite structures, in flight test instrumentation, in the aerodynamic design of quiet jet aircraft, had been accumulated over careers that in many cases spanned 3 decades or more. Those skills did not transfer to Woodford. They did not transfer anywhere. There is a detail in the BAE restructuring of 1992 that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the kind of detail that gets lost in the language of corporate announcements and financial write-offs. The BAE 146 was not cancelled because it was a bad aircraft. It was, by every measure that passengers and airport operators cared about, an exceptional one. Its 4-engine configuration, the same feature that made the accountants wince, gave it a safety redundancy that operators valued. Its noise footprint was so low that it could fly into airports that banned every other jet. London City Airport opened in 1987 with a runway so short and an approach so steep that most jets could not use it, was designed with the 146 specifically in mind. The aircraft that Hatfield built was not obsolete. It was irreplaceable in the niches it occupied. What it could not do was generate the returns that a privatized company answerable to shareholders required. The 4 engines cost more to maintain than 2. The production volume, never more than 36 aircraft per year, could not drive unit costs down to the levels that would make the program commercially sustainable at the price airlines were willing to pay. In a different institutional context, with longer investment horizons, with patient capital, with a board that measured success in decades rather than quarters, the 146 might have been developed into the family of aircraft it was clearly capable of becoming. That institutional context had been dismantled, piece by piece, over the preceding 15 years. What followed the September 1992 announcement was not a sudden closure, but a slow unwinding. The particular cruelty of a site that knows its fate but must continue functioning. Through 1993, the remaining work was completed or transferred. Engineers who had spent careers developing aircraft at Hatfield packed their desks. Some transferred to Woodford, many did not. The institutional knowledge that lived in their hands and their memories, the accumulated understanding of how to design a quiet jet, how to manage a flight test program, how to solve the specific engineering problems of a 4-engine regional aircraft, dispersed into retirement and redundancy and other industries. The Avro RJ, the upgraded 146, with new engines and a modernized cockpit, continued in production at Woodford. British Aerospace had not abandoned the aircraft entirely, but the Avro RJ was Hatfield's aircraft being built by other hands in another place, like a piece of music performed without the composer. In November 2001, BAE cancelled the next generation RJX program and closed the Woodford regional aircraft operation entirely. The final Avro RJ, delivered in 2003, was the last civil airliner manufactured in Britain. Hatfield was gone by then, had been gone for 9 years. The property developer Arlington Securities, BAE's own property division, had already drawn up the master plan. The runway would be dug up, the factories demolished, the flight test hangar, a Grade 2 listed structure from the 1950s, would be retained and converted into a hotel and leisure centre. The administration building that Geoffrey de Havilland had built in Art Deco steel and glass in 1934 would become a police station. The future that de Havilland had built was being converted, methodically, into the present that someone else needed. The morning of the 8th of April 1994 arrived the way English spring mornings do. Pale light, a low sky, the smell of cut grass and cold air. At Hatfield Aerodrome, people came who had no official reason to be there. Former engineers who had taken redundancy months earlier. Retired test pilots who had first flown from this strip of Hertfordshire farmland in the 1950s. Apprentices from the de Havilland Technical School who had learned their trade here and gone on to careers in aviation around the world. They came because they understood, in a way that no press release had acknowledged, that what was ending today was not merely a factory closure. It was the end of a line that ran unbroken from 1930. The aerodrome had been largely silent for months. The assembly halls were empty, the design offices cleared. The flight test hangar, where Comets and Tridents and BAE 146s had been prepared and inspected before their first flights, stood hollow. The runway, 2,000 meters of concrete laid in 1947, long enough for jet aircraft, strong enough to have supported 60 years of flight testing, stretched across the field in the pale morning light with no aircraft on it and no aircraft expected. Except for today, the ceremony that had been arranged was not an official BAE event. British Aerospace had made its announcements in September 1992 and moved on. What took place on the 8th of April 1994 was organised by the people who had worked here. A farewell arranged by those who were being left behind, for a place that the institution that owned it had already stopped thinking about. The first aircraft to move was a de Havilland Chipmunk, a two-seat trainer, the same type that had made the first landing on the new concrete runway when it was laid in 1947. The symmetry was deliberate. The Chipmunk taxied to the threshold, held for a moment, and then accelerated down the runway for the last time. It lifted, climbed, circled the aerodrome once in the pale morning air, and came back down. When its wheels touched the concrete and its engine reduced to idle, the main runway at Hatfield had been used for the last time in its history. The crowd that had gathered along the perimeter watched without speaking. What happened next had been planned with the care of people who understood that some moments require the right aircraft, the right crew, and the right passenger, and that getting those things wrong would diminish what they were trying to honor. From the grass strip at the side of the aerodrome, not the concrete runway, but the original grass surface where de Havilland had flown his machines in the years before the war, the surface that connected this day directly to 1930, a de Havilland Tiger Moth was prepared for flight. At the controls was Dick Bishop. His father, Ronald Eric Bishop, had designed the Mosquito. His father had designed the Comet. His father's name was on the office block that British Aerospace had built on the site of the original 1930s factory, Bishop Square, named in honor of the man who had drawn the aircraft that made Hatfield famous. Dick Bishop had grown up with Hatfield as part of the fabric of his family's life. Today, he was flying its last flight. In the passenger seat was Anne de Havilland, granddaughter of Sir Geoffrey. She had, earlier in the morning, lowered the de Havilland Company flag, not the British Aerospace flag, the de Havilland flag, the one that carried the name of the man who had built all of this, for the last time. She carried it with her into the aircraft. The Tiger Moth's engine turned over, caught, and settled into its familiar rhythm, the sound of the 1930s, the sound of the aircraft that had trained a generation of RAF pilots, the sound that Geoffrey de Havilland had heard from this same field 60 years earlier when Hatfield was new and the future was entirely open. Dick Bishop advanced the throttle. The Tiger Moth rolled forward across the grass, gathered speed, and lifted from the same ground where the founder had once stood watching his machines take shape. It climbed into the pale Hertfordshire sky, the de Havilland flag streaming from its tail. One circuit, slow and deliberate, the way a farewell should be, not rushed, not dramatic, but present. The aircraft that had started everything, flown by the son of the man who had designed the aircraft that changed everything, carrying the granddaughter of the man who had built all of it. When the Tiger Moth landed and the engine was cut, the silence that followed was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a place that had held something for a long time and had now let it go. The crowd did not applaud. There was nothing to applaud. In the weeks and months that followed, the process of erasure was methodical and thorough. The assembly halls came down first. Vast industrial buildings that had housed mosquito production lines, Comet prototypes, BAE 146 final assembly. Decades of work that had at various points employed tens of thousands of people. The demolition crews moved through them systematically, and what had taken years to build came down in days. The concrete of the runway, the surface that the Comet had rolled across on July 27, 1949, before lifting into history, was broken up in 2001 and used as hardcore fill for the foundations of new roads and buildings. The site was redeveloped according to a master plan adopted in 1999. A business park, residential housing, a university campus, The University of Hertfordshire purchased part of the site, naming it the de Havilland campus, so that the name, at least, survived in the place where the man had once built aircraft. The flight test hangar, Grade 2 listed, became a David Lloyd Leisure Centre and a hotel. The Art Deco administration building that Geoffrey de Havilland had commissioned in 1934, the building that had looked out over 60 years of flight, became Hatfield Police Station. The streets of the new development were given names: Comet Way, Dragon Road, Mosquito Way. The developers understood, in the way that property developers understand such things, that heritage adds value. The names of the aircraft were retained. The knowledge of how to build them was not. Today, more people work on the site of the former Hatfield Aerodrome than worked there when it closed. They work in offices and call centers and retail units and university buildings. On clear days, aircraft pass overhead on their approach to Luton. Jets built in Seattle or Toulouse carrying passengers who have no reason to know that the field below them was once the place where the idea of flying in a jet aircraft was first made real. One structure from the original aerodrome survives intact and in recognizable form. In the de Havilland Aircraft Museum, a few minutes' drive from the former factory site, the prototype Comet, GALVG, the aircraft that John Cunningham flew for 31 minutes on a July evening in 1949, stands in a hangar, preserved and still. It is the only Comet one prototype in existence. It is the beginning of the jet age, standing in a museum in the town where it was built, waiting for someone to ask what happened. In the years after Hatfield closed, 3 people who had worked there told their stories in different ways. Their names are not recorded in the official histories. They are the kind of people who rarely are. The first was an aeronautical engineer who had joined de Havilland straight from the technical school in the early 1960s. He had worked on the Trident, then the BAE 146, accumulating 3 decades of knowledge in the specific discipline of quiet jet aircraft design, understanding how to reduce engine noise, how to configure nacelles, how to manage airflow in ways that made the difference between an aircraft that airports welcomed and one they tolerated. When Hatfield closed, he transferred to Woodford. He arrives to find that the culture was different, the priorities were different, and the institutional appetite for the particular kind of patient engineering that had defined Hatfield was largely absent. When the Avro RJX was cancelled in 2001 and Woodford's regional aircraft operation shut down, he took early retirement. The knowledge he carried, specific, accumulated, irreplaceable, retired with him. The second was a woman who had worked in the flight test department for 20 years, managing the documentation and instrumentation records for every aircraft that flew from Hatfield in the 1970s and 1980s. She did not transfer to Woodford. The redundancy package was adequate. She retrained, eventually working in logistics for a distribution company in Hertfordshire. She was not bitter, she said in an interview given to a local history project years later. She was matter of fact. The work had been good. The people had been good. And then it had ended. The way things end. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with an announcement, a date, and a process. The third was a young apprentice who had joined Hatfield in 1991, 2 years before the closure was announced. He had come because de Havilland, even under the British aerospace name, even at the end, carried a reputation in engineering circles that still meant something. He was 20 years old when the closure was announced. He was 22 when the gates closed. He went on to work in aerospace elsewhere. Not in Britain, as it turned out, but in France, for a company called Airbus. He spent his career building the aircraft that the studies begun at Hatfield in the 1960s had, in a roundabout institutional way, helped to make possible. He found that quietly ironic. These three people represent thousands. The dispersal of Hatfield's workforce was not a tragedy in the theatrical sense. No single moment of rupture, no mass demonstration, no political crisis. It was the quieter, more durable kind of damage. The dissolution of a community of practice that had taken 60 years to form and could not, once broken, be reassembled. Skills of that kind do not wait. They retire. They emigrate. They find other uses. Institution that held them decides, a generation later, that it needs them again. They are simply gone. Set aside for a moment the question of what was lost. Consider instead what was given. The de Havilland Aircraft Company at Hatfield operated for 64 years. In that time, it produced aircraft that shaped the modern world in ways that are still felt on every commercial flight taken anywhere on Earth today. The accounting of that legacy deserves to be stated clearly, because it is routinely understated in the histories that focus on the Comet's disasters rather than its consequences. The Mosquito demonstrated, at a moment when the Air Ministry did not believe it, that a high-performance combat aircraft could be built from non-strategic materials by a workforce that included furniture makers and cabinet joiners. That lesson, that unconventional materials and unconventional thinking could outperform orthodox engineering, echoed through British aerospace for decades. The Comet did something more fundamental. It established, through catastrophe, the scientific framework that makes modern commercial aviation safe. The investigation at Farnborough in 1954, the water tank tests, the wreckage reconstruction, the meticulous documentation of metal fatigue under pressurization cycles, created the foundational methodology that every aircraft certification process in the world now follows. The oval windows on every aircraft you have ever boarded, the fail-safe structural principles built into every airliner since 1955, the underwater wreckage recovery techniques that are standard practice in accident investigation. All of it traces back to what happened at Hatfield and Farnborough in the 2 years after the Comet disasters. Boeing knew this. Douglas knew this. Every manufacturer that built jet airliners in the second half of the 20th century built them on knowledge that de Havilland's engineers and the investigators at Farnborough had extracted from disaster at enormous cost. The 707 was safer because the Comet had not been. The passengers who flew safely across the Atlantic on Pan Am and TWA and BOAC through the 1960s and 1970s were, in a direct and documentable sense, the beneficiaries of what 56 people died to reveal above the Mediterranean in 1954. The design studies at Hatfield in the 1960s fed into the Airbus A300, the aircraft that launched the European consortium that would eventually challenge Boeing's dominance and reshape the entire structure of the global aviation industry. The BAE 146, for all its commercial difficulties, pioneered the operational parameters of regional jet aviation and demonstrated that jets could serve short-haul routes from constrained urban airports. London City Airport exists in part because Hatfield built an aircraft quiet enough and capable enough to use it. These are not consolations, they are facts. Hatfield's contribution to the world was not diminished by the institutional failures that ended it. The contribution and the failure coexisted, as they so often do in British industrial history. The achievement real, the reward captured elsewhere. The people who made it possible left to find their own way forward. There is one more thing to be said, and it concerns not what Hatfield gave the world, but what the world chose to do with the giving. There is a version of this story that attributes what happened to Hatfield to misfortune. The Comet disasters were genuinely unforeseeable given the science of the time. The Gulf War recession was genuinely devastating to the aviation industry. The economics of a 4-engine regional jet in a 2-engine market were genuinely difficult. If you arrange the facts in a certain order, Hatfield's closure looks like the outcome of a sequence of bad luck. A company that tried hard, encountered obstacles that would have defeated anyone, and eventually succumbed to forces beyond its control. That version is not false, it is incomplete, because running alongside the misfortune is a second sequence, not of bad luck, but of decisions. Decisions made by institutions, by governments, by boards of directors, each of which individually appeared reasonable, and each of which, in aggregate, dismantled the conditions that made Hatfield possible. The decision by Hawker Siddeley in 1960 to purchase de Havilland was a commercial transaction, not a conspiracy. But its consequence was the removal of the direct line between a founder's conviction and the factory floor. The quality that had produced the Mosquito against Air Ministry objections and the Comet before any government specification existed. When that line was severed, something was lost that no org chart could restore. The decision to nationalise British aerospace in 1977 was made with genuine industrial intent, but its consequence was the absorption of Hatfield into a bureaucratic structure where civil aviation was a secondary priority behind defence contracts worth billions, where the patient investment that the 146 programme needed was perpetually competing with demands from programmes that carried more political weight. The decision to privatise British aerospace in 1981 was made with genuine market intent, but its consequence was the replacement of long-term engineering ambition with quarterly financial discipline. The introduction of a metric that the BAE 146 programme could never satisfy, not because the aircraft was inadequate, but because the returns on complex aerospace programmes do not arrive in the timeframes that shareholders require. And the decision to close Hatfield in 1992 was made with genuine financial necessity. But its consequence was the permanent dispersal of a community of engineering practice that had taken 60 years to accumulate and could not be recreated once it was gone. Each decision was defensible in isolation. Together they form a pattern. The pattern of a country that built something extraordinary, failed to protect the institutional conditions that made it possible, and then, when the extraordinary thing was gone, named streets after it. Comet Way, Dragon Road, Mosquito Way. The names are still there. Walk them on a weekday morning and you will pass commuters heading to offices, students crossing the university campus, delivery drivers navigating the business park. None of them are building aircraft. None of them are doing what the people who worked here did. The quiet, demanding, cumulative work of designing machines that fly. In October 1958, a Comet 4 and a Boeing 707 both crossed the Atlantic carrying paying passengers within 3 weeks of each other. One had to stop in Canada. One flew non-stop. The aircraft that stopped was British. The aircraft that flew straight was American. That gap, not in engineering capability, but in institutional support, in patient capital, in the willingness of a nation's industrial structure to back its own best work through the difficult years, was the gap that determined the next half-century of commercial aviation. Boeing today employs around 170,000 people. Airbus employs around 130,000. Between them, they build virtually every large commercial aircraft flying anywhere in the world. Britain, which invented the commercial jet airliner, manufactures components for both. Good components, well made by skilled people. But components, not aircraft. That is not inevitable. It is not the natural order of things. It is the accumulated consequence of the decisions described in the chapters above. Decisions that could have been made differently by people who could have chosen differently at moments when different choices were available. Geoffrey de Havilland understood something that the institutions that eventually consumed his company did not. He understood that the future belongs to whoever builds it first and protects it longest. He built his factory without government help. He designed his aircraft against official objection. He bet on speed when the consensus said speed was impossible. Bet on jets when the consensus said jets were impractical. Bet on Hatfield when the consensus was that London's suburbs were the right place to build things. He was right every time. And the institutions that absorbed his company, rationalized his factory, and converted his runway into housing foundations were, in every meaningful sense, wrong. The last flight from Hatfield was a tiger moth carrying a folded flag. Not a jet. Not something new. Something from the beginning. Slow, wooden, fragile, improbable. The kind of aircraft that a man with a vision and his own money might have built in 1930 on a Hertfordshire field, when the future was still entirely open. It climbed, it circled, it came back down, and that was the end of it.